An economist by training, Desmond graduated from the University of Cambridge in 1969 and received a PhD in economics at the University College London in 1988. Before this, he was a volunteer in Tanzania and from 1971 to 75 a consultant undertaking studies in Africa, Asia and Latin America. He joined the DPU in 1976 and was a lecturer in urban economics. He was also involved in the technical advisory service in various countries. Since leaving the DPU, Desmond has been the head of research and director of the Centre for Development and Environment at the University of Oslo. Desmond, you joined the DPU in 1976, right?
Yes, that's right. Yes, you probably got it better than I have. That's right. So that's where it began. Yeah.
And what at first attracted you to the department, to the DPU?
Well, I guess, I like Colin. I got a very good impression of him as a dynamic, interesting person. I felt, as I say, I had got a bit turned off consultancy, and it seemed to me that this nevertheless was a place where you could sort of combine academia and consultancy, where you could, combine, if you like, research and action, which is what I was really, I suppose, interested in. I think for a university department it was remarkably practice-oriented, and I think that was one of its strengths. And at that time, the courses were mainly for practitioners. I got thrown into the deep end completely because I was asked to co-organise a short course on planning of new towns in developing countries, which I didn't know a lot about, but in theory I knew a bit from my Egypt experience. And that was, senior people coming for a few weeks or months, and even the other programs we had were mainly experienced people learning and then going back and using their experience, but also basing, sort of learning a lot on the job and therefore learning also from each other. So yes, it was absolutely, yeah. And therefore a little unusual within the university. It was a sort of family, a feeling of a family, for better or worse. We had our squabbles and so on, but nevertheless it was a very intimate, a very nice bunch of people. Again, I think partly also because we were unusual in a sense, always under threat, always having to just make the balance the budget, always feeling that somehow we weren't quite fitting into the university, which in a way sort of helped, integrate us. Yeah. So I like that as well. Yeah.
And when you came to the DPU, did you have like a nagging question, something that you thought? Your preoccupation that you wanted to research or to teach?
Not really, as I say. In a way, I didn't know much about. I knew quite a lot about development planning in a sort of very broad sense, but not much about urban development and housing. So I had to learn that on the job, as it were. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And what was your more particular focus?
Well, I was teaching. I was doing some teaching on economics, urban economics, and so on. But I quite soon got involved in the technical advisory services. I was put in charge of that, with sort of consultancy arm, as it were. Mm-hmm. And so that was putting together projects in different countries all over the world. And so quite a lot of my time and effort was engaged on that.
Mm. And did you have to go to these countries? Like
yes.
There was in Accra, there was a...
Yeah, we had... Accra was before my time. I think Ghana was before my time. When I came in, there was... one of the big ones was Amman, Urban Region Planning Project. Another was Juba, housing in Sudan. Another, which went on for a long time, was housing in Sri Lanka. I did a project with Nigel on the metropolitan MMDA, Madras Metropolitan Development Authority. So,
what did they entail? These like capacity building?
Yes, Amman was one of the most interesting, I think, because we were hired. In fact, by USAID, which is very unusual because normally they would use their own people. But somebody had to sign a letter saying no one in the US had the competence to do this, so we got the job. And there we were capacity building of this recently set up Amman Urban Region Planning Group. And I went out first with Ronnie Ramirez. And I remember we said to ourselves, okay, this has got to be really practical. So we will, instead of going out with a syllabus, we will go out and find, okay, what have you got on your desk? What are you working on now? And then we would have to design our teaching to help them do that, which was challenging but very interesting and very effective. Mm-hmm. And in a way, in a sense, our success was measured by the fact that they were began to know so much, the young people we were teaching rapidly became more competent than their seniors, and in fact their boss came to me one day rather sort of embarrassed and said, look, I feel these guys know more than me, please can you send me on a course so that I feel I know what they're talking about. And in fact they became so competent and critical that it actually threatened the organisation, because they were asking quite valid and important critical questions about what the organisation was doing. So it was that was very successful counterpart in terms of counterpart training. I guess one of the things I really am interested in is precisely that relationship between research and policy. I should maybe add that, as I think I mentioned, I sort of slowly moved from practice more towards academia, and one of the moves was when I was just finishing at DPU, I did a part-time PhD, and then I decided, well, I don't want to do it on something practical, I want to do nice theoretical. So I decided that what is value is a good question for a PhD. So I wrote my thesis on Marxian theory of value, on the fetishism and commodity fetishism and the form of value, which for me was completely novel. I hadn't read any Marx. I hadn't really taken on this critical political economic perspective, and so that that was, firstly, it was a hugely enjoyable, interesting experience, but it also very much influenced all my ideas since. As also when I was at the DPU, I did one of the first, in fact, urban sector reviews for the World Bank, with Mike Cohen, who later became a good friend of the DPU and head of the urban division of the bank, and very influential in terms of urban development policy. But he was at that time I was even younger, and so I did this urban review of Mali. Well, it was only Bamako really, because there are no cities in Mali, and that got me quite interested in the role of cities in development, and as I say, this idea that Nigel especially promoted also of seeing cities in a positive light.
So what did you do after the DPU?
I got the job as director of a centre, in some ways a little similar to DPU. It's called SUM, that's the Norwegian for Centre for Development and the Environment, and that was at the University of Oslo. What I've been working on there, especially in the last 10 years, I suppose, is largely on issues of global governance. So I've written some books on multilateral organisations. I did a book on ideas called Framing the World, how ideas frame the way we think and therefore frame the way we act, sort of neo-Gramscian sort of idea. Taking certain ideas like the informal sector, in fact, the informal sector, sustainable development, these sort of ideas which come from academia and shape the way we think and act. Then I did another book on multilateral organisations in the private sector, public-private partnerships, and then a third one on the whole ethics and human rights agenda, and what multilateral organisations do, or in practice often fail to do, in relation to following up that agenda. So that global governance, the sort of political economy, if you like, of global governance has been very much what I've been working on. I suppose what runs through all of them is what you might call depoliticisation, the way in which the politics gets squeezed out in aid, in global governance organisations, in subtle and sometimes not so subtle ways.
Squeezed out means
it's
dressed up as apolitical?
Yes, I mean, one obvious example is the concept of governance itself, which of course is an intensely political concept, and yet was largely treated as managerial, technocratic. But the example of the Ethics and Human Rights book, which is the latest of them, is quite interesting. How when the World Bank and the attempt was made to take up these issues, and yet it was either sort of kept below the radar, as they say, or it was treated in again a technocratic way. So the human rights are important because they lead to economic growth, or ethics similarly, or equity, or in the UNDP again, where they did have an apparently fairly sort of radical human rights agenda, it got again controlled and constrained, in that case, in that instance, by the board, the executive board themselves. So that where obviously the political element is absolutely crucial and runs through all of these relationships between North and South, it is sort of consistently kept under control, kept aside, not explicitly discussed or faced. And I'm interested in that phenomenon, how it happens and why it happens.
So a broader question,
Yeah.
looking more into the future, what would you consider the main challenges for urbanization that we basically need to address?
Yeah, well, the big one is the environment, and I don't just say that because I'm working at a Centre for Development and the Environment, and it does challenge. It challenges, of course, urban, rural, everything, but the idea of urban being positive is seriously challenged by environmental problems. Some of them can be better dealt with in cities and in high population, high density, but many of them can't. Similarly, climate change is going to have big problems for certain cities. So I guess it has to be cities. But again, perhaps one could turn the thing round, just as one did with the economic aspect. That cities can also be leaders. They can, if they have new ideas, they can test. Mayors can test them out at a city level. You can innovate perhaps more effectively, or certainly spread innovation more effectively. So I think environment is going to be, that is the big issue. But it doesn't, and I think it challenges the idea that urbanization and city growth is positive, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it completely negates that.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of the role of the DPU in addressing this, how do you?
Well, I'd like to see, if indeed, one can see cities as both positive and negative, especially perhaps positive, because maybe that's what's not being seen. I think the role of the DPU could be to demonstrate that that's the case, at least to challenge, simplistic arguments about why cities are a problem, and to do that, but not just in theoretical terms, but hopefully in terms of practice, showing what works or what can work. Although also what doesn't work. I think there's a tendency for policymakers to always say, "Oh, tell us what works, tell us what works." And I think one also has to find what doesn't work and why it doesn't work. It doesn't. So a critical view of what is being done is very important, and also a view that takes in the variety between. I mean, that again is one of the strengths, of course, of the DPU, is this enormous geographical variation, and to be able to draw on that diversity is enormously important, and to resist sort of simplistic across the board solutions which apply by implication, all countries, all cities, and so on. So that's also important.